You're listening to the NABS Now podcast.
Hello and welcome to the NABS Now podcast. I am today's host. I am a mystery voice for likely many of you. My name is Noah Carver, and I'm currently pursuing my Bachelor of Music at Eastman School of Music in vocal performance. I became involved in the National Federation of the Blind in 2023 when I was very honored to receive a national scholarship. Since then, I have jumped in headfirst into NABS. Just recently, I've been, again, very humbled to be made a co-chair of the Content Creation Committee. That brings me to the NABS Now podcast, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. And joining me today are two folks who have been absolutely instrumental in the NABS Now podcast over the past few years. Seyoon, Choi, and Kinshuk. Thank you both for being here and spending some time with me and our listeners.
Thank you, Noah. This is really exciting. You all know me. I'm your typical host, and then this time we're here to talk about all things NABS Now podcast.
Right.
Excited to be on the seat here.
Yeah.
And this is my first time actually as an interviewee on the NABS podcast. As Noah said, my name is Kinshuk, and I was a former chair of the Content Creation Committee, as well as former board member for NABS. Relevant to this project, I used to be a lead producer on this podcast.
Absolutely. And Seyoon, tell us a little bit about what you do for the NABS Now podcast.
Yeah, so I serve as a project lead currently. I've been around NABS since 2019, so I'm really dating myself here. I've been around NABS for about 5-ish years now. My time as a student is inching towards the end, month by month, day by day. Now, I'd like that to go a little bit faster, but it's also a bittersweet time for me as I transition out of being a traditional student as I wrap up my graduate school. So yeah, this
Folks,
project is a
counting
near
down
and
days.
dear near and dear to my heart. But so I'm excited to talk to all of you to share a little bit about a bit of the backstory, so to speak. And Noah's gonna take charge of that. So I'm really excited.
Absolutely. So, and as both Seyoon and Kinshuk have alluded to, today we're doing something a little bit different. We're turning the tables, as it were, and we're talking about how the NABS Now podcast gets made because, hey, why not? Seeing behind the mirror or seeing how the sausage gets made is a lot of fun sometimes. So before we get into that, though, how about a little bit of history? Fun history. I promise this is not like history class. We're not going to put you to sleep. But how did the NABS Now podcast come about? And who are some of the people who have been formative, important to its creation and continued maintenance?
Yeah, so the idea of a podcast had sort of floated within NABS around 2018 or 19. Catherine Webster, our beloved National Association of Blind Students president, had experimented with an idea of creating a podcast or a flagship podcast that represents a vibrant voices of blind students. Authentic voices of blind students. And the only way that Catherine believed would happen is if students within NABS took charge, would produce the thing, record, brainstorm ideas, and it would be a very involved initiative. 2018-19, I was transitioning out of high school. 2019 high school graduate, so I was just wrapping up high school and transitioning into college, and that's when I stumbled upon a friend of mine. Her name is Nina Morinka. She had a very vital role in starting up the NABS Now podcast at its sort of groundwork phase. Nina had reached out to me to get some input on what a podcast production should look like. She was looking for some assistance and some help to see how can we produce this thing. Areas in audio editing and production was sort of the talent that NABS was recruiting at the time. As I said, 2019 was the year that I was starting college. So I was like, NABS could be a really vital opportunity for me to jump right in. So it was a moment when I said, yes, I will do it. And I'm willing to do this. The birth of the podcast initiative, really, it was August or September of 2019. We really started recording, getting some ideas. Now, the first couple episodes were a little rough. You could go back to season 1, episode 1. It's called Legislation 101. And you'll notice quite a stark difference between the audio qualities that sort of set the groundwork back then, how far we've came now.
Sure, but you live and learn as you sort of do these
Oh,
these things. And
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, it was
Sure,
all
sure.
about learning and living and learning and growing. We had this lovely 15-second intro. Um, and
Right.
we had a podcast, we had an audio that sounded like you're talking through a landline. Um, there was a little less structure. It was really fun. We had a lot of good presenters through and through, and those presenters have really came on the podcast and spoke again. Yeah, 2020 was our first inaugural season. Season 1, episode 1 came to life. The rest of 2019 was really spent on laying the groundwork, making sure we have the intros, and then picking out what really distribution looks like and all that stuff, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a second. But that's sort of the history. It's been a roller coaster, but yeah, it was really Nina and myself who, with the support, with guidance and mentorship from Catherine, who have continued to march this project forward, and we had Trisha Kulkarni, who's a former president of NABS, who've continued to support the podcast very strongly.
Right. And of course, our current president, too, now Lauren Altman. So, Kinshuk, how did you get involved in the podcast? What was your role in the world of the NABS Now podcast?
So the podcast world and the podcast for NABS kind of came to me at a time that made sense looking back, but was a total surprise. So as Seyoon was saying, Seyoon was one of the founding fathers, if you will, of the podcast project. And at the time, it was just him and Nina pretty much doing all of the work for the first year or so, right? I found NABS in 2020 when I was a freshman in college. I'm also a 2019 high school grad. So I'm a little bit older than I was back then for sure.
I
But
think I'm the youngest one here.
yeah, I know, right? I found NABS right before COVID. During COVID, I was a performing arts kind of person. I did a lot of music, a lot of band performances, things like that. And with COVID, I found myself not being able to have the same kind of creative outlets that I normally would have had. And I was thinking of ways where I could be creative with all this new found free time I had with the pandemic. Therefore, I decided to make music. I made music with my instruments. I made some covers of popular songs, things like that. I had a lot of fun with it. And a lot of my friends at the time who were in NABS took notice of this like newfound skill I had of audio editing. I was still very much an amateur in audio editing, but I was starting to learn kind of the basics of it. When it came to the podcast, the leadership at the time, including Trisha, came to me and asked me, "Hey, you have this like new skill you're developing in the audio production. Would you be willing to like help out Seyoon and Nina with the podcast?" And it's a big shift of what I was putting out there at the moment. And so I considered it heavily. And I thought to myself, hey, like, I want to give back to this organization that gave so much to me and is still giving so much to me. This sounds like a cool opportunity. And so I jumped on the team. And from spring of 2021, I believe, to 2023, I helped with making the podcast happen with Seyu, Nina, and others that came after. And one thing I forgot to mention was that the podcast at first for me was a new territory and kind of stressful, but I quickly found that from balancing school, working on the podcast helped me kind of escape from all of that. And so
Sure.
for me, it was very therapeutic to actually work on those episodes. It took many hours, yeah, but I found a lot of interest and I guess happiness from working on the episodes and putting a product out there, working with others, and being proud of that product. It was an escape from the stresses of school for me for many years, and so the podcast is very near and dear to my heart.
Yeah, and I
Sure,
would agree.
absolutely.
I
And
would sort of echo that sentiment too. That's why I've stuck with this initiative. I've supported the work that our federation does for so many blind students at the NABS had played a role in me. So I felt like a podcast it's one of our proudest work I feel like that we do at NABS, and it's
sure,
certainly very close to my heart.
absolutely. So, thank you both for getting into your backgrounds and sort of the history of the podcast as a whole. Speaking of recording and production and all of that, we'll get to that. But my next question is, in essence, how do you decide what gets recorded? Where do concepts or ideas for podcast subjects come from? And can NABS members sort of have a say in that process? And how do they have a say in that process?
As I've shared earlier, student input is vital for our podcast to continue. Ideas all come largely from blind students. So whether that be we had committee calls where students could join, all are invited, and would share out ideas. We would have a lot of brainstorm sessions to ideas that are sent oftentimes over email or gets spread through word of mouth through from blind student to blind student, to now that we have the NABS Town Hall, which is a monthly meeting where it consolidates all committees within NABS and all of the happenings within NABS into just one Sunday per month. So there are a lot of platform and avenues where ideas can get taken in. It might be even ideas voiced through our NABS Facebook page. So there's a lot of sources, and we sort of take that all into consideration.
So what I'm hearing here is, if you have an idea, get involved, talk to people, come to the meetings, and make your voice heard, because we may well use it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And oftentimes in the past, a lot of our episodes that we produced were ideas directly from membership, because as leadership, it's our responsibility to amplify the voices and wants of membership. And so we have a really cool position here in the podcast team to where we can make ideas become reality. So if somebody, for example, wants to learn about what are some ways that they can make easy, fast, and affordable meals in a college dorm room, we have the connections in NABS to find people that can talk about that subject, and then we'll make that happen. So that's kind of the power of the podcast, and how we do very much value having input directly from membership.
So once an idea is sort of brought to the table, it gets put in and sort of discussed and agreed upon sort of by leadership at that point. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the committee leadership, so as it stands today, the committee has undergone several makeover. So at one point we had NABS Communications Committee, which became an outreach committee. So the podcast was always under those umbrella. So it went from communications to outreach, and now as it stands today, which better reflects some of our latest NABS initiatives, including podcasts, is called content creation, which is focused on distribution, publishing, and creation, really, and production of the contents that NABS as a division continues to crank out. So the committee leadership will decide on an idea as sort of unanimously, and then we'll begin the task of doing an outreach to necessary speakers and coordinating recording times.
Sure. So how does, I'm assuming, so the NABS network is huge, and not only with the NABS, but also the Greater Federation. So I assume that's sort of, you decide on a topic, and then you're like, okay, who can speak about this? Who's qualified to talk about this? Who can we have on? Do you reach out? Does committee leadership reach out? How does
So as a podcast project lead, I take a lead on that outreach aspect of it.
Okay, gotcha. So then comes recording. So how long would you say do recording sessions take, and sort of what goes into the process, and what gear is used? And so how does all of that come about?
So I think the biggest thing with us recording is we don't expect our guests to always have the condenser microphone set up, the dynamic microphone set up, or they might be in a dorm room with just their smartphones or their laptops. Nowadays, thanks to a lot of the software enhancements and in sort of the meeting and conferencing systems, we can get a pretty good recording out of, let's say, an iPhone microphone or a laptop microphone. And we'll talk about post-production a little bit too. But yeah, the recording all happens over Zoom, and sort of like how we're recording this show. And we just do our best to grab as most clear voice audio as much as possible during the recording. Generally, the recording is around 30 to 45 minutes in length, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, factoring in post-production process too.
Sure. And so basically you hop into a Zoom room, make sure everybody sounds okay, and then hit record. Wow, that is surprisingly simple. I mean, when people think of podcasts, they often think, big, huge NPR type place with a whole bunch of editors, and not only like executive producers and millions of dollars of equipment. And that's not the case. You can really make a nice sounding podcast.
And oftentimes there's sort of that overgeneralized assumption that we have to have a microphone set up, and then podcasting has to be difficult. And I think nowadays, with just so much evolution around smartphones and audio processing. Gone are the days of having those kind of audio setups. Certainly, you're more than
Sure.
welcome to have that optionally, but that should never be an expectation anymore.
Sure.
I feel like with enhancements to audio processing.
Sure. So the recording gets made, and then comes the fun part, because even in today's show, we've had little things have happened. I've mispronounced a word or messed something up, or someone gets a phone call, or a dog barks, or someone drives by on a motorcycle. You can't leave all of that stuff in. How does a recording with imperfections, as it were, then get turned into something that is professional sounding and concise that people want to listen to?
Once the recording session is finished, Seyoon or whoever was hosting that meeting would then channel that audio file into a form that we can access as editors. We all use different platforms and on different devices. Many of us use Apple products, not sponsored, but
Apple is not
so
paying us money for this endorsement. I just
unfortunately,
want to add.
fortunately not. But a lot of the software we use is actually free and very accessible. And so we channel this audio as raw audio file into these audio editing softwares for which we can then kind of hack away. A lot of it is as simple as making cuts in the audio track, like splices, splicing the track into two different segments,
Sure.
cutting out the part that you don't want, like the filler words, like you know, motorcycle driving by, those kind of sounds. Filter those out or cut those out, and then we put those two pieces of audio back together to make them one. So that way, we want to create a very seamless audio experience. Thinking about people listening to the podcast while they're commuting to school or just chilling at home, like whatever the occasion is, like we want to have a story be told and it be very seamless and high quality. So a lot of it is just that very simple editing, but then we also have some really cool tools that I'll let Seyoon talk about more so, because after the laborious part of hacking away at the audio file is done, there's a beautifying of the audio as a whole that we can then implement, which I'll let Seyoon talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, so things like that can be normalizing everybody's volume. So not all microphones capture voices at the same level, unfortunately. So
Right. Not to mention people move.
Yeah, people
away from their
move.
mics or move closer.
Sort of different voice range and vocal frequencies too. So I know
Sure.
I have a pretty lower range voice compared to maybe the rest of you, or vice versa. So what audio normalization will do is sort of level out, so it's not like spikes and peaks and valleys. It's more of a stable audio. When you listen to it, you don't have to turn your volume up to listen to Noah, say, and then turning it down when you hear my voice and so forth. And sometimes we'll add fun sound effects. We will sometimes add cuts, which can be very beneficial for when we have sound bites or recordings coming in. So we can feature multiple voices and insert them where appropriate. And then certainly our beautiful intros and outros. Intros, we always like to have the president of NABS record a little bite, so they always have a role in it. Yeah, so things like that all gets done during a phase I like to call a post-production, which often happens in a lot of professional, formal, informal media content.
Sure.
And then once the post-production is finished, there's a very last step where we make sure that everybody involved in the project reviews it and is cool with it, make sure there are no other final edits that need to be done. And once that's finished, we'll then do post-production, which is basically just writing a title, a description.
Yeah, all the metadata of the show, so to speak.
Right, sure, absolutely. And then it goes onto the internet. So as a matter of fact, how does it get there? How does it get from a file on someone's computer to something we can all listen to?
Yeah, so that local file turns into this final stage, if you will, is a distribution process. Luckily, these days, a lot of independent podcast creators are out there, and so is there a platform for it too. It was once called Anchor, is now merged with Spotify. It was acquired by Spotify, which, as many of you know, is a popular music streaming service, and now they expanded to audiobooks and podcasts, and they're trying to do 3 other things in one app. Spotify for Podcaster is a very powerful tool. We use that. So all of our podcasts all of our past episodes are now available on the back end side of things. we use Spotify for podcasters. So this is something that anybody could really use, but that's where it's like YouTube or TikTok. You upload the podcast file, enter title and description, and they really handle the rest. So if you're well versed into a podcast world, you'll notice there's several different ways to consume podcasts these days. There are different apps that have different features for podcast listening. Certainly Spotify, you can listen to podcasts. There's Overcast, Pocket Cast, through Amazon Alexa. Hopefully I didn't set your Alexas off. Google speakers, Apple Podcasts, certainly built into a lot of Apple devices. Spotify for podcasts is sort of, we call it the host or the provider that funnels it out to all these different platforms and really broadens our footprint of how people can access podcasts. That is also available. Our content, also we have a feed into our website, nabslink.org, and then you can click listen to our podcast, and then you also have access there. So that's sort of the final phase, is the distribution and publishing.
Right. And all you had to do to get it to show up on all of those places is just post it to Spotify for podcasts. Wow. Okay. So to me, this sounds really daunting, but you both approach it like absolute pros. I mean, you've been doing it for a while. How much of a learning curve is it to get involved in this at the level that you guys are doing? And how long did it take you to learn the ropes? And what were resources that you used in your journey to learn the skills which you have and which you use in the creation of this podcast?
I think that the barrier of entry for content creation in general is declining as the years progress. Think about short form content and how that's blown up ever since the pandemic started. Everybody can make content from the devices that they already have, right? And so it's one thing we always stress in the content creation committee is that you can make content because we can make content. We're not pros or any kind of like certified podcasters. We're just a couple of people that have an interest, a passion for this kind of stuff, and we want to make it happen. But of course, it is a skill and it does take time to develop. Seyoon has been working on the skill for many, many years. I entered it a few years ago, but honestly, it just takes practice. And if you look back to our first podcast, like Seyoon was saying, they're a bit rough compared to now because we've had practice to refine our process and our methods. When we first established the content creation committee, we actually sat down and really, really defined and thought about fundamentally what is content and what is the process from start to finish. And we outlined a 7-step process that we could kind of apply to any kind of content we make, including podcasts.
Yeah, so I want to echo that sentiment. Again, we're not pros. We're just a couple of blind students who wants to make content that just represents the authentic voices of blind students. I think one of the things that also really stands out to me the most is that you never really know until you try it. This might be something that you really enjoy. And I think mentorship and resource is instrumental in that process. Certainly I had a little bit of skill coming in, but that should not be a deterrence or a requirement. You don't need any experience. If you just want to say like, hey, I've just heard everything about NABS Now podcast. Now I'm interested. So how can you get involved? You could either send an email to myself, which will be at the show notes at the description box, just as Choi at nfbmo.org, or nabs.president@gmail.com. So connect with me or Lauren or Hunter, who is our current committee chairs, but committee chairs do rotate on a yearly basis. But we will make those contacts and point of contacts available for you on the show notes. But yeah, if you're just interested and you're like, I might have a passion for even the slightest, but then you're like, I don't even know where to begin. But this sounds like a very intriguing initiative that I would love to join as a blind student. There is an opportunity for you, and it's fun. We don't want this to feel like it's ever like an additional work that you have to do on top of your schoolwork. That's why we have a team for it. We divvy up the work. Certainly production was the area that we needed more hands. And then that's sort of where we have those resources that we can share with you all. And then there are plenty of mentorship opportunity available for you as well if you decide to jump in and feeling like you're unsure where to begin. With repetition and with time, as Kinshuk said earlier, things get refined, things get fine-tuned, and eventually, like with anything in life, right, you continue to practice and fine tune, and then it becomes sort of more of a fluent process.
Yeah. And to your point, like putting this together, this is the first time I've been involved in the NABS Now podcast at such a deep level, having been asked to host this episode. And I was super nervous to do this, not gonna lie. And we started recording, and honestly, this has been fun. This has been super cool. I have enjoyed every minute of it, and being able to talk to you both, being able to ask questions about how a thing that I've listened to for a good long while gets made. It's really been an awesome thing to be a part of. And so that's really a great point that you make. Creating something like this isn't just work. It's also not only great fun, but it provides you with lots of great marketable skills, not to mention the work that's done as part of this podcast, amplifying the voices of blind students and providing this sort of outlet is quite impactful to all sorts of folks. And so you really become part of something that is much bigger than yourself. And that's what I have noticed, even as someone who has been part of the committee and not directly related to the podcast. I've walked away with the sense from you both that that is the feeling behind the podcast and its creation, what it's left you both with. Would you say that that's accurate?
Most certainly, yeah.
Sure. Wanting to loop back to editing real quick, you mentioned, I believe Kinshuk mentioned that folks use different tools and things. What do you both use, and what are some other programs, audio editors and things that you've seen used or which are used in the creation of the NABS Now podcast?
I'll go first really quick because my setup is actually super, super low tech compared to Seyoon's. So I pretty much just use an iPad Pro, iPad Pro 2021 model, I believe.
Nice.
And I use a GarageBand, the application, which is actually
built-in free app.
Built-in,
Right.
yeah, it's one of the best audio producing applications on iOS.
And
Right.
it's fully accessible.
Fully accessible, comes with your iPad or your iPhone. You can get it on the App Store, and it's free. It comes with your Apple device. And how did you learn how to use it? Just talking to people in NABS? Like how did you
I think
That's
the
a good
pandemic
question.
also provided us a lot of ways to just do a lot of
Yeah.
self-learning.
that was your pandemic project.
I kind
While
of
we were
alluded
all
to
laying
it.
in bed, like, you were like,
Yeah,
how do we use
honestly.
this?
Honestly, we had so much free time, and for me, like I was making some music at the time for fun, for myself, to show my friends, things like that. And so in the process, I had to learn audio editing to make that music accessible in a digital format versus live performance. And so that's how I kind of learned it, was just by playing around with it, seeing what was possible on GarageBand. And not all of it applies to podcasting, of course, but when it came to the podcast project, I could apply a lot of those skills. And now it's kind of vice versa, to where a lot of my podcasting skills and practice has translated into when I do make music, which is these days very occasional. It's much better than where it was during COVID.
Right. So the skills have sort of moved laterally to your other passions. What about you, Seyoon? What does your workflow look like?
Oh, jeez. I'll try to simplify this.
We're going from the simple, easy solution to the next level up. We're leveling up, y'all.
Oh, it's not even that fancy. So I have a microphone hooked up to my audio interface, which is feeding audio signal into the computer. This is not even that expensive a microphone, folks. It's $79 microphone. It's dynamic mic. Picks up whatever you got in front of it. Pretty good for podcasting. Primarily, I'm a Mac user. It helps me be really productive. I'm recording this episode on a Mac, and I use an app called Amadeus Pro, which is a $49 app that I bought, many years ago, 6-7 years ago, to experiment what audio editing could do. Like, I was a junior in high school, so I was thick and thin through marching band and sort of like Kinshuk, music production, audio production, just for fun. That's totally not my area of study. So bought a $49 app. There is an audiobook by an amazing podcast, Persona, Jonathan Mosen, based out of New Zealand, and he did an entire Amadeus Pro sort of a maestro series. I was listening to the audiobook and studied up how to use the audio production software myself. It's a very simple software, and it's completely non-visual, fully accessible audio production application, and that sort of my personal interest came handy. As Nina put it, like I was a person that they were exactly looking for to kickstart the podcast. So that is
Sure.
sort of my setup. Still relatively simple.
Absolutely. Just to chime in, I have also used Amadeus Pro, and I did not have the Jonathan Mosen book. I do not recommend doing it this way, but I basically got the app and then was like, how do I use this? Push button, find out. It is actually very intuitive, a great application for this purpose. And if you're a Windows user or a Mac user, there's also another application called Reaper, correct? And there are a lot of blind folks who use that now too. And there are a lot of great supports for that as well. I know Jonathan Mosen has also done a lot with the Blind Podmaker and Reapers Without Peepers and things like that. Those are all Googleable things, and they're boundless resources for blind folks looking to check out Reaper, which is an audio application that works on Windows and Mac. And these are all great for recording audio and editing audio and making it sound absolutely fabulous. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you both for taking the time to talk with me about how the NABS Now podcast is made each month. It really has been a pleasure. Before we close out tonight, I wanted to ask a bit more of a lighthearted question, and a question that I honestly have been thinking about asking since I got asked to host this. What is, for both of you, what has been the most memorable podcast or podcasts that you've worked on in your time with the NABS Now podcast?
I would say really quickly, one of my favorite episodes, which there are a few that are high up there. One of my favorite episodes is the one we did in October of 2022. And that one was about the marching arts. It was called something like In Unison, Marching in the Marching Arts or something like that. And it's really cool for me because as a huge fan of the marching arts and professional marching band and that sort of thing, it was really cool to kind of merge those two worlds. This podcast with some interviewees who were blind marchers. And this podcast happened during the month of the Marching Band Championships that season. So that was really, really fun to do.
That is awesome. And I'm taking notes, by the way, because as a musician and someone who was in band in high school, I definitely want to hear this one. I'm going to go back and find it. What about you, Seyoon?
I have several. One of the episodes that jumps out to me already is our celebration of really Blind Equality Achievement Month in October. There, we featured over 15 voices of blind students who've submitted audio submissions, and that engages community. That engages people to have a part in the show. And that was very powerful for me, and just putting it all together. Even to this day, I'll go back and listen to answering the two prompts. What does Blind Equality Achievement Month means to you? What does your long white cane symbolize? And that really sort of stands out to me. The other one that sort of got a national recognition from our folks over Future Reflections within our federation was involving the dynamics of blind siblings. And that was an intersectionality of different disabilities along with blindness, and that was all very powerful stuff. Yeah. I could go on and on and on, but I think those are the ones that stand out to me. And the last one that I would like to highlight is applying for college, which can be a very scary thing. So we actually did an episode. We usually try to sequentially do it around the time where college application season's really going through people. And then it was October of 2021 or 2022. I think it was 2021. And then we actually brought in a lot of guest speakers who actually had an opportunity to share what their college experience, college admission process was like, and the application was like. Anything from an individual, like a blind student who's been homeschooled, to sort of a high school graduate, future high school graduates who are applying for college and they're thick of it through the process. And I thought that was particularly a hallmark episode, just because like it really does reflect an authenticity of blind students.
Yeah. I really wish that I had known about that as I was applying to colleges. I feel like that would have made the process so much less stressful, that I would have had much more knowledge about what I was getting into and what I was doing, and also the comfort of knowing that, hey, other people have done this. You can survive this too. Well, again, thank you both so very much for coming on. Thank you, Seyoon, for passing the host baton my way for today's episode, and thank you, Kinshuk, for coming out from behind the curtain. Really has been fantastic to talk to you both.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Noah and Seyoon, for having me on the podcast today. It was really fun.
I really enjoyed it. Sort of being the backseat of the card. I really enjoyed it. This episode of the NABS Now podcast was hosted by Noah Carver, along with producers Seyoon Choi and Kinshuk Tella. Sound edited and mixed by Seyoon Choi and James Yesel.
This podcast was brought to you by the National Association of Blind Students, a proud division of the National Federation of the Blind.
Find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Mastodon, and TikTok as NABS Link or National Association of Blind Students, or on our website, nabslink.org. Be sure to subscribe or follow our podcast for new episodes and more links in each month. Thanks for listening.